Good afternoon, good snowy afternoon, and welcome back to the 2021 Speaker Series, City Center Speaker Series from Downtown Partnership. I'm Claire Swinford, Director of Urban Engagement for Downtown Partnership of Colorado Springs. And for those joining us for the first time today, Downtown Partnership is a nonprofit organization that has served the urban center for decades, working to ensure that downtown continues to benefit the whole community as the economic, civic, and cultural heart of Colorado Springs. And like many of you probably, I've watched this city change a lot over my lifetime, and it's our pleasure to offer you this speaker series as a point of connection to help us all understand our roles in ensuring that our city continues to change for the better in this new decade. And for the past 6 years, the City Center Series has invited nationally renowned experts in urbanism, innovation, and design to speak to the concerns of our community advocates, our elected officials, our students, our industry leaders, all alike, and get them to communicate in more informed and inspired ways. Our goal with the City Center Series is to make the conversation about our developing city ever more thoughtful and inclusive. We're especially excited to present this year's speakers entirely online because we know it means a lot of you in the audience are able to join us for the first time, and we are so glad you're here. Speaking of our collective role as advocates for positive change, we want to start by alerting you to an upcoming opportunity to become informed and get involved, and that's happening tomorrow evening, February 18th at 5:30 p.m. And the City of Colorado Springs will be sharing the results of its new community-wide transportation study. This interactive virtual public meeting is the first time we get to see the data that's going to shape the next 20 years of planning for transit in Colorado Springs. So we are thrilled that it is happening. And now I can't see my notes anymore, sorry. We're thrilled that it's happening the day after we hear from Tamika L Butler, who's going to tell us exactly what needs fixing and how in our transit systems to make them truly safe, efficient, accessible, and connected for all. So please take a minute to bookmark coloradosprings.gov/connectcos, coloradosprings.gov/connectcos, and pre-register for tomorrow's event because that's exactly how the great ideas we hear tonight get put into practice. It's up to all of us. So like the other public benefit programs of Downtown Partnership, the City Center Series is made possible by our members. These are local businesses, regional employers, and community-minded individuals who believe, as we do, that Colorado Springs does best when its downtown is thriving, and they play an active role in our mission. Members in the audience tonight, thank you so much for joining us. Special thanks go to our President's Council members who support downtown at the highest level. You see them there on the screen. But membership is open to everyone. So if you're fired up by what you hear tonight and want to do more, please email info@downtowncus.com to join us. This year's speaker series would not be possible without the support of the Colorado Springs Business Journal and the Colorado Springs Health Foundation. We want to thank CSHF not only for their financial support, but also for their inspiration to think better, think bigger, do better, as we explore how our whole community benefits when we pay attention to resiliency, equity, and creative placemaking. We want to thank our community partners as well, who have supported us by spreading the word about this series to their stakeholders. And now I would like to recognize Susan Davies of the Trails and Open Space Coalition, our sponsor for tonight's talk. Now, why is our local Parks and Trails Advocacy Group sponsoring a talk on transit? I'm going to let Susan break it down for you.
Well, thank you, Claire. And thank you to David Lord, whose generous support provided TOSC with this opportunity. The Trails and Open Space Coalition seeks to be your eyes, ears, and voice for trails, parks, and open spaces in this region. More miles of connected trails, safe, well-maintained parks, more acres of open space. Those remain the focus of our advocacy. We hope to offer you the opportunity to extend and expand the city's incredibly successful TOPS program next fall. But first, we need to fix a restrictive ballot language and ask you to acquaint yourself with issue 1 on the April ballot. You decide if improved clarity, accountability, and transparency matter. Finally, thank you for using our parks, trails, and open spaces responsibly during the pandemic. They've never been more important to our physical and mental health. As we celebrate our 150th birthday as a community, cherishing, caring for, And improving these assets is the finest way to honor our founder. Claire?
Thank you, Susan. We are also joined tonight by Jolie Nismith, Executive Director of Pike Ride e-bike share. She will be moderating Q&A at the end of tonight's session. So if you have questions for our speaker, please feel free to drop those into the Zoom chat. Please do remember our community guidelines and keep your comments brief, polite, and on topic. For now, please mouse over the upper right-hand corner of your screen to enter speaker view so you can have the best visual possible. And a final note before we get started, this speaker series continues through April, and we have 2 more fascinating talks and topics in store. You can join us again on March 17th, 1 month from today, for a chat with Dan Carmody, the dynamic and irreverent president of Eastern Market Corporation, the nonprofit that manages one of Detroit's most venerable institutions. He'll be chatting with us on what it takes to retain the soul of a city undergoing rapid change and development, and how that work contributes to greater health and opportunity for its residents. You can pre-register for our talk with Dan and the rest of the City Center series on our website, downtowncs.com/citycenter. If you're curious about other downtown partnership events, you can also take that opportunity to sign up for our newsletter and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Tamika L Butler, a national expert on issues related to the built environment, equity, anti-racism, diversity and inclusion, organizational behavior, and change management. Tamika has a diverse background in law, community organizing, and nonprofit leadership. And recently, Tamika was Toole Design's Director for Planning for California and Director of Equity and Inclusion. Tamika also brings experience from the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors as the former Executive Director of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust, a nonprofit organization that addresses social and racial equity and wellness by building parks and gardens in park-poor communities across Greater Los Angeles. Before that, Tamika was Executive Director of the Los Angeles County Bicycle Association, LACBC. We are so excited for our audience to learn from all of this experience at the nexus of mobility and equity. So please join me in welcoming Tamika L Butler.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'm extremely excited to be here. I'm excited to see so many people joining. We're gonna, as Claire said, have some time for question and answer after this. But if something comes up, if you wanna say, yes, I agree, or no, or wait, what did you say? Feel free to put things in the chat as we go. You can change that to panelists or panelists and attendees. And as things come up, we'll try to catch them and make sure that we get back to them when we get to the Q&A. And sometimes I can even leave them in as I go. Very excited to be here. I have put together a presentation. I will talk for maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, probably half an hour. And then we'll go ahead and move over to the Q&A. So hopefully, everyone can see my screen, and I will go ahead and get started. So I want to talk about transportation equity and why we have to be talking about this work right now. More than anything, for me, I'm a person who likes to tell people what I'm going to tell them before I tell them. That's really, really important. And so that's what I'll do. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do, and then what is it about the white space of transportation, and what can everybody do to help. So who am I? A little bit about myself. I'm living in Los Angeles right now, but I am from not too far from you all in Nebraska. Our state motto is the good life. And for folks who don't know much about Nebraska, there's a lot of corn there. And usually that's all people think, especially when I give these talks out in California where I live. People are like, what is Nebraska? What is there? And there is corn. We've been really lucky, thanks to this last round of political hijinks. People now know us as the place where people wait out in the freezing cold on runways. And even more recently, people know us as the state that has the small little district that could go either way and could have a huge impact on a very close election. And that little second district is where I'm from. I'm sure my parents and my sister are mixed in those demographics somewhere. I left the Midwest because at some point I was just, I was growing up as a Black queer kid in Omaha, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so Black, I'm so queer. I have to get out of the Midwest. And so naturally, when it was time to go to graduate school, I thought I'm gonna go to the gay Mecca. I'm gonna go out to San Francisco. I'm gonna go out, come out to San Francisco. And so I thought I was doing that, but instead I was going to Stanford, which was a rude awakening because Palo Alto is not the same as San Francisco, and frankly because I was so Midwestern. All of my friends who were at Stanford from much larger cities asked me all kinds of questions, like I know many folks out there understand. For those of us who live in this part of the country, why are you holding up open the door for everybody? Why are you smiling at everybody? Why are you talking to everyone? We don't have time for that. So being on the West Coast helped me realize how, in fact, Midwestern I was. The other reason it was a rude awakening is because San Francisco, despite being viewed as this gay Mecca, San Francisco is not actually a place where there are tons of Black folks. I remember getting there and just wondering, where are all the Black people? You grow up in a place like Omaha, and like I said, one of the themes of this talk is going to be about white spaces. And you grow up in Nebraska, which is a white space, and you feel fully prepared to go to a place without a ton of folks of color. But I remember getting to San Francisco and just realizing how segregated everyone was. And it really made me want to practice law and specifically represent the Black community. And so my job out of law school was opening up workers' rights clinics in two parts of San Francisco, the Western Addition and Bayview Hunters Point. And those were communities that had been historically, Black communities. And right as I was opening my legal clinic, the San Francisco Muni opened up a new Muni line that was going out to Bayview Hunters Point. And people in Bayview Hunters Point were super upset. No one wanted to talk to me about their employment law issues if they didn't know where I stood on the Muni line. And part of the reason people were upset about Bayview Hunters Point and getting this new Muni line is because, for folks who don't know the area, Bayview Hunters Point is where the San Francisco 49ers stadium used to be. And so a lot of the folks in the community who for generations had been cut off from the downtown core of the community, who didn't have access to great jobs, to healthcare, to education, because they were so geographically and transportation wise like isolated from the core of downtown, they didn't feel like any of those things mattered when this new Muni line was built. Instead, what it felt like is that there is a Muni line being built to get tourists and folks from other parts of the city with influence and money to see the 49ers. And that was really the only concern. It wasn't about who got the local jobs to build out the Muni line. It wasn't about what time is the streetcar running? When is it not running? How does it align with the bus schedules? What's more reliable? None of those things seem to really involve the people in the community. And what I heard, a constant refrain I heard over and over again, is this wasn't planned for us. This wasn't planned with us. This was planned in spite of us. This was planned for someone else, right? And so even though I was a civil rights lawyer doing employment law, that's when I first realized that transportation is this through line to everything we do. And now I've had a number of jobs after leaving law. I went into public health, and that's what ultimately brought me to active transportation and biking and walking and working at an organization that built parks and gardens, really seeing the tie and the intersectionality between public health and our built environment. And what so often sticks out to me, even now, right, as we see folks all over the country lining up outside of vaccination sites, hoping that someone didn't show up for the appointment. And then you hear judgment when folks say, if I had a chance to get a vaccination, I would not show up. Like, who doesn't show up for their appointment? Well, folks can't get there. This isn't a new issue. When AIDS was first ravaging the gay community, there was study after study done about why people weren't showing up to doctor's appointments. And time again, one of the leading factors was a lack of transportation. We can't be economically mobile if we're not mobile. We can't have access to quality education or housing or healthcare if we can't get there. And once I really put that together, my mind was blown. I was like, what is this? What is this urban planning and why has no one told me about it? As I said, I got more involved. I love riding my bike. And so I led our bicycle coalition in Los Angeles. And I've gone on to do things like serve on the board of organizations like Transit Center. So really bringing together how transportation gets us through. When I talk about myself, which as you can tell, I like doing since we're already, about 8 minutes in and that's all I've done. I always like to introduce my family. And part of the reason I like to introduce my family is because sometimes when you get invited to speak, people assume you're an expert. And when people assume you're an expert, sometimes they don't want to ask questions because they don't want to ask anything dumb. And the reality is, I'm really not much of an expert. I'm somebody who has a wife and a son, and I want this world that we're living in to be better for them. And so I do this work and I thrive and I, get my expertise out of a place of care, out of a place of wanting to make things better. And if you care and if you want to make things better, then you can do this work. I also share this picture because my wife, as you can see, is white, and as you can see, I am not. And when we as two super liberal queers on the West Coast were having a son, we had a long conversation about whether or not we should raise him free of gender, let him grow up and tell us who he was. And ultimately, we made the decision that that would be irresponsible. And not because we won't accept him, whoever he is, but because he's Black. And in this country, when you're Black, the color of your skin is viewed as a weapon. And so we felt it would be irresponsible to not raise him that way. We want him to be a Black boy full of joy, but we also want him to understand the realities that there will be things he might be able to do and say that will be viewed totally differently than how it would be when his white cousins do and say it, right? That is our responsibility as a parent. And when we made a decision that we were going to raise him as a Black son, my wife didn't get to throw her hands up in the air and say, cool, I'll see you in 20 years. You got this, right? I'm not Black. I don't know what to do. I don't want to say anything. Instead, she had to jump in. She had to understand why we lotion every single day, why we don't wash our hair every day, how we do our hair, all of these different things, right? What it was like to be a Black kid in school when you're doing the same thing as all the other kids, but you get labeled as a troublemaker and the other kids get labeled as boys just being boys, right? All of these things that she had to do the work to explore. And anybody who co-parents with someone or who is part of being part of a network that helps raise young people, you are probably sitting there nodding because that totally makes sense. My marriage probably wouldn't work out if it was just like deuces, I'm out. But for whatever reason, we don't carry that same energy into our professional spaces. Too often when we want to talk about equity in our work, we assume that if we're not part of an oppressed group, well, I don't have a disability, well, I'm not gay, well, I'm not undocumented, well, English is my first language. We assume that there's no work for us to do. Now, certainly, we should step back. We shouldn't take up all the space and we should let those folks lead. But at the same time, we all have a role to play if we are going to make equity actionable. And that really should be our goal. And so you can't be so afraid that you're going to make a mistake that you sit back and say nothing instead of jumping in and participating. And so I hope, again, folks carry that energy, not just in their personal lives, but in their professional lives as you sit through this talk and beyond this talk when you go off to do your work. And when folks struggle with how to do that, one of the things I say is, well, you can hire me. I do have my own consulting firm, and this is the exact type of work I do, helping organizations and cities and individuals through coaching think about what their role is in fighting against inequities and social injustices. And a lot of my work is in the transportation space. About 50% of my clients are transportation clients, but 50% of my clients are in totally different fields, museums, nonprofits. And what I do is try to help people see, again, what their place is and what their work is. Now, I do love transportation. I do have a passion for transportation, but to bring, the full theme of this talk, it is a white space. It's been good business for me in the last year because all of a sudden everyone wants to talk about transportation and equity. And it's not that folks weren't talking about it before, but the folks who have historically held power in the transportation space haven't been talking about this work. What do I mean, folks who have historically held power? Well, when you look at the most common race of urban and regional planners, they are white by a large margin, right? 80% of planners are white. And if maybe we're not talking about planners, maybe we're talking about engineers, same thing, right? Mainly white men, a few more white women, but really the folks who are building our cities, who are telling people where they can and can't go, who are deciding what the use of a space is and what we could do here and not do here, those folks are often white. They're often white men, they're often able-bodied white men. And so, we have to acknowledge that when we aren't having everyone do the planning, are we really planning for everyone? The other reason that has always seemed problematic to me is because that's not who's actually using things like public transportation, right? Public transportation agencies are huge employers, but the demographics of the employees don't often match the demographics of the riders. We know that a lot of folks who are riders are women and people of color, low income folks, but that's not who has the fancy jobs in the offices, and definitely not at the top. When less than 5 transit agencies, CEOs across the country are women, we have a problem. The boards of transit agencies are predominantly white. And, fine, maybe folks aren't as into transit. We're in a space now in the transportation world where more and more people want us to believe that the true future of transportation isn't necessarily just public transit, but it's about technology. It's about how technology intersects with public transportation, how technology intersects with scooters and ride sharing. So when I think about transportation as a white space, and then I hear all these people telling me that the future of transportation is in fact in technology, well, then I just look at technology and I realize that, take one of the biggest technology transportation companies, Uber. Again, mostly men. That green part, that's the men. That long line, you know, that's white people. That's who makes up these organizations. And it gets worse when you go to leadership. The leadership of these organizations, again, mostly men, the light purple, mostly white. Well, maybe that's just an Uber problem. People would say, well, Uber's not representative of all of these technology companies. Well, let's go to one of their major competitors, Lyft. Same thing, right? What's the biggest circle? White folks. And is that better when you get to leadership? No. In fact, white folks are overrepresented in leadership. And so when I think about how do we change the fact that I've committed my life to doing transportation work and it's a white space, I think, well, maybe if we can get a new generation of people and if we can start teaching people in their educational settings that they have to be thinking about things like race and equity, then, maybe that'll help. Maybe in graduate school, we can see if there's a problem. But the reality is urban planning has a race problem. Urban planning professors from across the country met in Houston a few years ago, and it was right before the 1-year anniversary of the civil unrest in Ferguson because of the shooting of Michael Brown. And there is this study put out by Lisa Bates, a Portland State University planning professor, and she had this message: urban planning has a race problem, and it's a race problem that we don't want to acknowledge, right? And it continues in our academic setting. When you look at the faculty of graduate schools, they are mostly white. And and it's this thing of how do we make change if the people who we expect to make the change are continuing the status quo? And so I could really talk about planning all day and how wide it is, but we know that planning isn't the only white space. This is another set of demographics, right? Look at that big blue chunk. That's the white people. Where is another white space? Some of you have already figured this out. It's here. When you look at the population of Colorado Springs, when I said to my friends, I was talking to my friend Marisa Ramirez, Latinx, born and raised in Southern California. And she said, what's your next speech? And I said, oh, I'm doing the speech for Colorado Springs. She's like, oh, that's where my paternal grandfather's from. he left. He said it was just way too white. And so there is a bit of a reputation. And this makes some people uncomfortable, whether I'm talking about planning, whether I'm talking about cities, whether I'm talking about technology. I have this constant refrain of we have to talk about race. The only option, if we're going to do this work to our fullest, is talking about race. And often when I say that, I get somebody who rolls their eyes because they're just not interested in that option. They don't want to only talk about race. But I titled this presentation Transportation Equity, the time is now. Why is the time now? Because we are still in the midst of two major crises in this country, right? We are facing COVID-19 and racism. Black people are dying in the streets every single day. And we're also dying in hospital beds. We're also not getting vaccinated. Latinx people aren't getting vaccinated. We know that the disparities that existed in our systems were there before. We can talk about the public health crisis for Black and Brown communities around COVID-19, but it doesn't change that Black moms weren't living when they were giving birth. None of these things are new, but we have to start addressing them now because things are reaching a fever pitch. Sometimes it feels like we're living in two different Americas. Sometimes it feels like there are folks more concerned about how we open back up our businesses and do sidewalk dining so that we can have our boozy brunches. And some of us are just in the streets begging for folks to recognize our humanity. There are many of us who question where we will ever be safe. And for me, I have a lot of folks who I really love and admire, who are friends and colleagues who I do this work with, and they say things like, but that's why I do transportation work. Because transportation work is colorblind. It's the equalizer. It's where we don't have to talk about things like race. But for those of us who are folks of color, we know that transportation is on the front lines of being a propagator of racism and systematic equality, right? There have been police officers who have come out and said that they use public transit to hunt Black and Brown folks, thinking of reasons, right? But again, none of this is new. None of it is new. These are things we've been facing for a very, very long time. When people say I'm not interested in the option of talking about transportation or planning and race, I ask how. How can you be in a country, as I sit in Los Angeles on stolen Tongva land, how can we be in a country that's very existent, started off based on white supremacy and colonialism and stealing land from people that we put up fences around and said, look, now we have a national park system. This isn't really our land, we're taking it, but it's a national park system. And now we can charge people to get in. If you look at the demographics today, who still doesn't use that land? It's no different in transportation. Since my ancestors were brought here enslaved on a ship, transportation has been a part of our story of oppression. Whenever you talk about transportation and civil rights, race is a big part of it. But again, it's a part of every aspect of our country. When you talk about the prison system, when you talk about environmental racism, and where do we have industrial pollution but lack residential mobility? When you talk about school segregation, and more than anything, when you talk about, again, planning, the big picture, and redlining. When we're doing this work and when we're thinking about the fact that, you know what, now is the time to do transportation equity work or planning equity work, we still have to think about the fact that if we want to do this work, we have to figure out how to acknowledge that it is a white space and decenter that whiteness. What does decentering whiteness mean? The Color of Law is a great book. It's a great book about redlining. It's a New York Times bestseller when it came out, was a New York Times bestseller again this summer when everybody rushed to show how woke they were by reading books like White Fragility and The Color of Law. And this book, I've read it, I think it's great. I've been on panels with the author, but the subtitle of this book is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. That's a prime example of centering whiteness. Because if you talk to any person of color in this country, we haven't forgotten how government segregated America. We haven't forgotten the lack of generational wealth. We haven't forgotten that the other side of the tracks is a phrase that people use and it means something. We haven't forgotten how interstates decimated our neighborhoods. And we haven't forgotten that just because of the color of our skin, we still die at higher rates, right? And so whenever you say, I want to start doing equity work, and this is so new and innovative because we just haven't talked about this before or thought about this before, we've never approached it this way. Who is we? We have to realize that if we want to do this work, that we can't center the white experience because it's not the only experience that matters. And so when I think about how do you transfer that to a place like Colorado Springs, well, first I did my research. I wanted to know the things I needed to know before moving to Colorado Springs, right? All of the things I searched on Google showed me beautiful pictures of mountains and the outdoors. And then I dug in deeper to this plan, right? That you just heard about. And this website is awesome. If you haven't been to this website, you should go to this website. The data is easy to read, it's easy to pull, and it's easy to understand. And what I learned is that in 2020, the second time this report came out, there were some things that were great, right? That despite the pandemic, construction was still happening at record levels. Even though tourism was down, it was still better than anywhere else in the country. All of these things were great. And like I said, the data was easy to pull. I've learned very quickly that this is a car-centric place, and that they think that folks here think it's important to have these other options. But when you look at how often people take the bus, that black line that's really long is never, never. And so what is the dissonance that people think something is important, but it's just not being used, right? And how is it that, people say that they want to ride bikes, that they are casual bikers, that they are folks who think it's easy to walk or use a wheelchair? You live in a place where over half the people think it's easy to walk. That's huge. But what would make it such that more people did it? Well, for bikes, the number one complaint was that there was no safe bike lane. And for sidewalks, people wanted better connectivity and they wanted the sidewalks to be in better conditions. This is what would make people feel safe. This is what would make people use it, right? I think the thing that stuck out to me the most is I was trying to put myself in the place of someone who lives here and works here and is really committed to the downtown area. Is how could you have all of these great resources, great visuals, something that someone like me could put together a whole presentation from just one website? But again, I'm still struck as a Black person by how white the space was. I'm still struck by the fact that I wanted to talk about race. I was asked to come and talk about race and equity. And it is really hard to find any of this data broken down by race. There are very few places where you can't get this data, but then also see what the disparities are across race. And something that one of my mentors always says is, you measure what matters. And it's almost like folks of color are invisible. And I couldn't quite understand it because, again, the point of this talk was the time is now, and the time is now because we're in a pandemic where this virus is killing us, right? I've had COVID-19. My mom is a essential worker who's gone to work every day, doesn't have the privilege to sit behind the screen in an office. She's been exposed, she's had to quarantine. My sister's an essential worker, she's a teacher. Black and brown folks are losing people. And so as much as we might think that the only thing stopping us from biking or walking are facilities, better sidewalks, better bike line, right? Like feeling safe. The reality is if you go through this world, if you live in this country as a person who inhabits a Black body, you know that you could go viral one day because there's somebody on your neck while you're screaming out for your mom, breathing your last breath, and that green bike lane in the background didn't keep you safe. You know, you could be walking around your neighborhood just eating Skittles with a hoodie, or in a pandemic, trying to get out for a jog, trying to increase your physical activity as everyone tells you to do, and you could lose your life. You could be someone in LA County going on a bike ride, getting stopped for a bicycle infraction and never living. Or you could be right here in Colorado Springs, right? Earlier, I showed you a Black cop from New York who said that they were sent to hunt Black and brown people. Our country is such that now other people who are mad at somebody can call the cops and say you're being attacked because you know that that is weaponizing. That is weaponizing the police department because you know the risk that something bad will happen to someone Black is huge. You could call somebody for something false, and a young Black man where you live could be shot in the back 7 times, right? And so for so many of us who care about this work and who want to come and just talk about transportation, because I'm a transportation expert, I've been told, I could help, I could do a lot of things, but it's hard when you're thinking about an insurrection and you're thinking about all of these different ways that you could lose your life. And you're like, well, I want people to know who I am because I'm good at my job. But maybe the only way that people will know who I am is if my name gets added to a list. And when you're doing that work and someone's saying, so what do you think about this bike lane? You kind of think to yourself, how can I answer this question? I'm not okay. And I always give like a seizure warning for this slide, but I use it because this is what it feels like. It feels triggering. And whenever we like to talk about these things, when we're out doing our transportation planning work, the number one thing we hear is, well, why are we talking about this? I'm not racist. And for those of us who do this work as folks of color, we're talking about it because that's what we have to talk about. If you don't have to think about all of these things, if you don't have to think about how all of these things are going to impact your work, if what safety really looks like, is it really just a better sidewalk? If you don't have to think about, if you're not a person with a disability and you don't have to think about how sidewalk dining is going to impact your ability to get and navigate a sidewalk, if you don't have to think about these things, it's because of privilege. And it's this belief that because something doesn't matter personally to you, it doesn't matter. And whenever people ask me, well, what do you think was the inflection point in us talking about equity in the last year? Well, white people started to be impacted. When you hear white people say, well, I hate being told where to go and I have to wear a mask or I have to do this and it feels so restrictive. These are things that folks of color have been complaining about forever. People trying to, surveil your movement. Muslim folks have been complaining about that. Not feeling like there's enough resources, like you can't find toilet paper, like no matter what you do, there's just never enough. Poor people have been talking about that for a long time. Feeling like there's places you can go and you can't go, and you don't know when it's safe and when it's not safe. And you don't know when you see somebody walking across the street, are they sick? Are they not sick? Are they going to harm you? Are they not going to harm you? Not in a like hit you physical sense, but these are things folks of color have been thinking about forever. And all we've wanted is for folks to stop killing us. And so when we do transportation work, one of the things I think about is when we think about white spaces, too often when we think about making changes to white spaces, we think about the outcomes. What do we want to look differently? How do we want the street to look different? How do we want this district or this neighborhood to look different? And what we have to start thinking about is not just what the outcomes are, but what is the process? Who are the people making the difference? How do we change a space that just so happens to be white? Well, who's making those decisions? So when you think about what you can do, think about a few things. One, how do you advance Black leaders? We know that African Americans are underrepresented in almost every aspect. And it's not just Black leaders, it's Indigenous leaders. In many spaces, it's women, people with disabilities, gay people. How can we help them advance? And how do we realize that organizational segregation is persistent? That oftentimes whiteness is a key credential to moving up in organizational hierarchies. Whiteness and maleness. And that doesn't just mean that you're a white or you're a man. It means that we're constantly telling women, well, to succeed, you have to do things this way. Well, why? Who did it this way? Well, the last 5 people who were in the position did it that way. Who are the last 5 people? Oh, men? Okay, cool. Oh, white folks? Okay, cool. We have to acknowledge that at a minimum, leaders have to stop thinking about just discrimination and inequality as these rare one-off events and understand that patriarchy and racism and processes that have those things built in shape behavior, even in the absence of ill intent. No one might mean to do something, but if we really want to start having conversations about how to change spaces, we have to start having conversations about our institutions. Before we talk about our external outcomes in the work, we have to do the internal work. We have to know the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity might be 90s clip art, get as many diverse faces as you possibly can, make sure it's a lot of women and somebody has a wheelchair and throw in an older adult for good measure. That might be diversity. But true inclusion means talking about power, that those diverse faces you bring to the table also have a say. That's power. You can have diversity and not have inclusion because there's been no shift in power. And so do those diverse folks, can they shape budgets? Can they say yes or no? Can they determine what you do? And if we want to get to equity, we have to understand that you have to talk about power. When we think about equality versus equity, a lot of people think about this picture, and it's a good picture because sometimes with equality, everybody doesn't get the same thing. Sometimes some people won't get anything at all, and some people will get more. But I hate this picture. And I hate this picture because it's not reality. It's not really where we start. And it's not where we should be trying to get. If we want to change anything, whether it's a downtown or an organization, we have to start thinking about a liberation mindset. I do transportation work because I want people to move freely with dignity. I want them to be able to get to the places and people they want to get to. But I also have to acknowledge that they have to have some say in that. I don't get to say we're going to watch a baseball game now because that should be your goal in life. I have to be willing to listen if they say, I hate baseball, or if they say, but I want to own the team. But I am an entrepreneur. I want to sell peanuts to the whole league. And so as you're starting to make change, start thinking about the fact if the only people who are different than those who have historically held power are there because they pretty much stay invisible. Take some time and just think for yourself about who the 5 people are that you trust the most in your professional circle. If you had questions about a project or if you wanted an idea on something, who would you go to? Who would you ask? And if you do that and you realize that many of those people are the same religion, are the same race, from the same country, the same sexual orientation, maybe you went to similar schools, then we have to start realizing that we're going to get the same results. I'll just wrap by saying that if you want to create institutional change, you have to create the brave space to do that. Too often we talk about creating safe spaces. As I said at the very beginning when I was talking about my son, there aren't safe spaces to be Black in America, but to be my true authentic self every day, I have to be brave. So if you want to do this work and you have the privilege where you don't have to think about that stuff all the time, be brave. Be brave enough to make a mistake. Be brave enough to keep going after you do. Be brave enough to acknowledge and hold yourself accountable and try to atone. And again, remember that power and privilege are what you really need to talk about if you're doing equity work. Simple way to do it. Ask yourself, what is this new project or policy we want to do? Who's going to be most impacted by it? Whether that's benefits or burdens, either way, who's going to be most impacted? And then look around your decision-making table. Are they there? And if they're not, you know in that moment you have a power problem. You have a power imbalance. And then challenge, who had the privilege to get into this room? Whose data did we consider was important to answer these questions? Data is important. It gives us a clearer picture. But data has to represent people, and we have to ground truth data by understanding the biases, understanding who's interpreting it, understanding what people would actually say. Am I an expert because I might have a degree, or is the person who sits on their stoop every day the expert? Is the grandmother looking out her window who knows everything about the neighborhood? Is she the expert? And we have to stop thinking about outreach. We use outreach and engagement interchangeably, but they're not the same. Outreach is still the same. It's the same concept as like we want to empower people. Empowerment is a colonial mindset because it's still saying I have power and I'm going to bestow it upon people. When you realize that what you're actually looking for is liberation, it's acknowledging that people have power and you're just there to facilitate that. You're just there to co-power. And when you realize that, then you'll stop thinking about outreach and you'll start thinking about engagement. You'll realize that outreach is just going out and saying, here's our plan. What do you think? But true engagement is saying, here's our plan. Do you think that's a good idea? Why not? Well, what do you think? Well, why? Interesting. Really being open and really being open to the fact that even though I'm a transportation expert, I talked about a lot of different things. I talked about a lot of different things because we have to start realizing as we do this work that for the people that we say we want to help, they're struggling with all of it. Climate change, transportation, their health, their finances, and just feeling like they're going to make it. And so when we do our work, we can't do it as single issue work. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not lead single issue lives. And so if you care about this work and you want to do equity work, remember, we might be in a ton of white spaces, but we each have the power to start making decisions and changes. And now is the time to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamika. We've got a special expert lined up to bring this conversation home. So I'd like to reintroduce Jolie Nesmith, who is the Executive Director of Pike Ride, our hometown e-bike share. And Jolie, I've seen the list of questions you prepared for Tamika. I know we're not going to get through all of them, but we've got about 15 minutes. So I'll let you guys take it away for as many of those as we can get to.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks for this opportunity as well. And Tamika, amazing. I've seen you speak before previously in some other during COVID Zoom opportunities, and you always are hitting a home run with your presentations. So I'm truly honored to be able to share some of this space with you right now. I'll look easy on some of these, Tamika. I'll start with some. And I'll also try to keep an eye on the chat, you guys, if you guys want to throw out a question. But yeah, so COVID and our current increased racial tensions have impacted everybody. I mean, communities across the world, but obviously, as you realized in your research, even here in Colorado Springs, in what ways there are some positives? In what ways do you see 2020 creating positive change for the future, and specifically regarding equitable access to all basic needs, including transportation?
Yeah, so I think, one of the things that happened, especially at the very beginning of the pandemic, when fewer people were driving, especially, is we all started to notice the air was a little cleaner, the birds were singing a little louder, the flowers seemed to smell more, back when I had a sense of smell pre-COVID. And I think there were moments like that where folks were like, oh, this is why GHG admission matters, right? And even though you didn't say it that way. And so I think there were many moments like that where everyday folks, but also folks in decision-making positions had to have these kind of, moments where they had to say, oh, I think we're seeing the same thing happen in Texas right now, right? There are people saying, we have to figure this out. Why is it so cold here? What's going on? And then I also think, I think when I think of 2020 and I think about race, the thing I always try to tell people is part of what happened is we were stuck. So you're inside, you're consuming news. I think we all consume news. Like I remember when my grandmother used to watch the news every night. And that's not really the world we're necessarily in anymore, but during the pandemic, that was the world we were in. Maybe you weren't sitting down and watching the nightly news, but you were doom scrolling, you were, consuming media. And so once we were all captive audiences and you couldn't ignore another person was killed, another incident, another, then people had to acknowledge it. And so I think what could come from that can move us forward in a positive way is that now that folks' eyes have been opened, it feels like there are fewer people who are going to turn away because you can't deny it anymore when you're watching it live on TV. I think for there to be true positive change, what we also need folks to do who are realizing it for the first time is do a little introspection. Again, don't just get straight to the results. Okay, well, now that I know, how am I going to fix it? But how do you interrogate within yourself why you didn't notice before last year? Did this just start to happen? Did it not just start to happen? And how can you force yourself to really be honest about why you weren't listening to certain types of folks before? And how can you force yourself to think about things differently? And so those are a few things that I hope people really take from 2020 and continue on with.
Basically confronting privilege. Sorry.
Yes.
In some previous, opportunities to listen to you speak, I've heard you talk about, as a Black person in this country, you could have never talked about bikes without also talking about race. I feel like that's a really valuable statement that I've seen you repeat in several different arenas. As a fellow bike advocate, I feel like it's something that I should likely adopt. But as a white person, it can sometimes feel inauthentic.
Mhm.
How do you address that? We already talked about us being brave, but also there's got to be some more tools in the tool belt that you feel like, as a white person, what can I do to really make that feel more authentic?
Yeah, so I think, part of it is that exercise where you think about the folks you trust the most. One of them is think about who you're surrounding yourself with, right? And how often when we're hiring, we're like, well, we have to get this project done. We need somebody who can hit the ground running. Okay, let's work our networks and figure out who we could get in right away. But what does that perpetuate, right? So who are you surrounding yourself with, I think, is an important piece. Now that doesn't mean, have a Black friend and all will be solved. But think about what you expose yourself to. So that could be changing the things you read, changing, the authors, the books, the podcasts, like the information that you consume. How can you as an individual start to diversify what you're hearing and the experiences you're taking into account, right? I think the other thing is folks say, well, I do have that one Black friend, or I do have that one friend with a disability, but it feels awkward to always go to them and always ask them. And so what I always tell people is that often those of us who are that one friend, it makes a big difference. If you just come to us and say, oh my God, I was at work and someone said I said something offensive. Here's what happened. Was it offensive? It feels a lot different if you say, hey, something happened at work. Someone said I was offensive. And I took some time and I really reflected on it. I did some research. I read this, I found this, and I've done some work on my own because the whole free internet is out there. And so I can do that. But now that I've had some time to do some of it on my own, are you okay if I talk to you about it? That's the difference between saying, could you do this work for me? And I'm making a commitment to doing part of the work. And so I think that's a big piece folks have to realize. When you want to do this, it's not just find the friend or hire that person who was undocumented and so can speak to the experience of undocumented people, but then you get to say, well, my work here is done. It's how do you meet folks where they are by partially doing that work and frankly making yourself the one that's uncomfortable, putting yourself in the vulnerable space of having to admit that you don't know everything, but you're trying.
Great, thank you. Hey, you obviously found our Connect COS plan, and as you said, it's pretty easily accessible. But also Colorado Springs City Council passed a complete streets ordinance saying that all streets should be designed and constructed to accommodate all users, calling out pedestrians, bicycle riders, and transit users specifically. Race is not mentioned. Should it be? And then I know the answer to this, but also why and kind of your perspective.
Yeah, I was working on this project with one of my colleagues who created this process where she helps organizations come up with an equity impact statement. And so if you say you want to do equity work and you want to make an impact, she walks you through a process to help you figure out, well, what would that be? And how she does that is she first makes you think, well, what's the problem I'm trying to solve? Well, I want to make streets safer for everyone, right? I want anybody to be able to walk into the street. And then she makes you think about some of the root causes. Why isn't everyone safe? Why can't everyone walk through the streets? And then she asks you to think about, well, what would it look like if there was equity. And then people often come up with that. And then you're like, okay, so what's your equity impact statement? And they usually say, it's that all streets are safe for all users. Or, a healthcare system where everybody has access to good healthcare and can, give birth and be healthy. And what we always try to explain to people in those workshops are that is akin to saying, well, I don't see color, I'm colorblind. It's something that you're doing because you want to be inclusive and because you mean well. But when you say, I want a healthcare system where all mothers can deliver healthy, happy babies and live while doing it, well, we actually have a healthcare system where most mothers can do that. It's just that Black mothers, no matter their income, you can read a story about a Black mother in a low-income community, or you can read Serena Williams' very moving piece that she did in the New York Times a few years ago about how she almost died. Because we have a problem with racism in our health system that when Black mothers say they are in pain or something feels wrong, people don't listen to them, right? And so a true equity impact statement isn't, I want all mothers to be able to deliver healthy babies. A true equity impact statement is, I want Black mothers to have the same birth experience as white mothers. And that makes us uncomfortable. We don't like to explicitly say things like that. And the reason I think it's important is because if you can't name something, if you can't say it, then you can't fix it. Because when you say, I want things to be safe for all people, then you're not really focusing on the people for whom it's not safe for. And what often ends up happening is, by all people, that gets watered down to most people, that gets watered down to the people who make the biggest fuss, that gets watered down to the people who have the most access to come to a meeting in the middle of the day at City Hall, right? And so it gets watered down. But if you're explicit from the beginning and you say, I want streets to be safer for people who walk and bike, well, then we've made progress because now you're explicitly naming it. But if you say on top of that, we know that traffic fatalities are higher for Black and brown people, then you can say that. And if you can't say race, if you can't say Black, if you can't say any of these terms, then I don't know if I can trust you. Because what are you so afraid of? Don't you want to help? And if you want to help, you have to be able to talk about it.
Thank you. We a couple of years ago when Bike Ride first launched, we also incorporated some new bike lanes in the urban, really the downtown core along Cascade. And it created some polar opposites and opinions of what that should be. But our city continues to increase bike lanes around town, or as some call it, just white paint. To increase mobility options. But is this truly a solution for providing safe spaces in regards to mobility and transportation?
I mean, as somebody who ran a bike coalition, you'll never get me on record saying I don't believe in bike lanes. I think those of us who like to ride bikes know that all bike lanes and bike infrastructure are not created equally, right? And that a true separated, quality bike facility is actually what's gonna make the biggest difference in the world. But I will also say that I think it depends, right? A good example is in Oakland. Oakland was one of the first cities that did open streets or slow streets during the pandemic. Said, we need more outside space. Like our public health department is saying people need to get outside. Where are people going to go? We need people to be able to socially distance. And in many cities across America, maybe not in Colorado Springs, because y'all got a lot of pretty nature, but in many cities, streets are one of our most valuable resources for where we can help people get outside and be socially distant. And so they launched their Slow Streets program, and it was wildly successful. They were on NPR, they were in the New York Times, they were everywhere. The head of the Department of Transportation, Ryan Russo, who I admire and respect, he was speaking everywhere, and it was a huge success. And then low-income Black folks in Oakland, many of them essential workers, came out and hated the program. This is not helpful. I'm still going to work. You're shutting down my street. You're changing my route. What is this? Who has time to be outside in the middle of the day? All of these different questions. And so when they actually talked to people about what they wanted, what they actually ended up doing was doing a second version of slow streets, which was slow streets, essential places. And so like an example of one of the things they did is go to this Black neighborhood where they were like, our only resource for food and for supplies is this corner store. But people get hit and killed crossing the street to get to this corner store every single month, right? Because it's just not safe. And so we don't want slow streets that are safer for recreation. We want a slow street that's safer to get us to where we need to go. And so when you want to figure out what's safe, is it white paint or is it not white paint? You have to ask yourself, well, what do the people actually want and what do they need? And in that same Department of Transportation, when they were doing bike lanes, they have one bike lane with the nonprofit that is down the middle of the street, is purple, orange, has circles and all sorts of things. And they did it with this nonprofit Scraper Bikes. And what they ultimately heard from folks is, if you put white paint down the side of the street, no one's going to use it, because that's not how we ride bikes in our community. And so safe, we think safe is an objective term, but it's not, because, people are dying every day. And so when you want to know what's going to help a community, that's why that picture where you take the fence down, and I say that's still not good enough because someone still had power and said, we're watching baseball. The real power is in saying, what do you want? And then working from there.
And again, the importance of engagement that you previously hit on.
Yeah. We are sitting at about 5 minutes, Jolie. I have one question from the audience, and then I'll let you wrap it up if you want to choose one more. But given what Tamika just said, I love that line. We think safe is an objective term, but it's not. That ties in really well to a question from Carolina, who's asking if, Tamika, do you have any thoughts on transportation and equity work and how it applies to emergency planning? Thinking again about before our attendees joined us, we were talking about the commonality of wildfire season here in Colorado and in California. So when we're thinking about how people utilize transit to escape from emergency, how does equity enter there?
Yeah, so one of my clients is the LA County Sustainability Office, and it's one of my favorite clients, and we're actually doing a project right now on doing a countywide kind of climate vulnerability assessment. And one of the things we're doing in that process is having these focus groups in community where we're talking to different groups of people who face different vulnerabilities. So some of them are outdoor workers, and what does this look like for you? And one of the focus groups I'm leading is about folks with limited mobility, because we want to know if there's an emergency, how are you leaving, right? And so I think one of the things we saw during COVID is the importance of partnership, and the importance of partnership before the emergency. By having these conversations now, we're not waiting for the big one to hit and then having a debrief after and saying, some people made it through, but those folks with limited mobility did not. Those folks who were outdoor workers didn't really have any options. And so part of planning for emergencies is doing that work now and building in all of these intentional things. Because what I always tell people is, too often I think our systems try to retrofit equity. And whether or not you're building a house or whether or not you're creating a public process, when you're trying to retrofit something, it always costs more money. And so we can't say we can't do equity work because it takes more time, it costs more money, because it will cost more in the end. And then the last thing I'll say is, this is also a really good example of where the overlap of transportation and technology has huge potential. I think there are a lot of things in the technology sphere that could really help with emergency planning, but I think we have to do it with the thoughtfulness of talking to actual people. Something we saw during the wildfires is, as people were trying to escape, they put it into their maps, their little software, and then they started driving into the fires because the algorithm was saying, go this way, there's not a lot of traffic. But there wasn't a lot of traffic because people were escaping a fire. And so again, that's the understanding that we have to combine data with people, right? And sure, the technology companies, they figured it out and they rewrote their algorithm, but doing that during an emergency is always more stressful and is always going to cost more lives than if we start integrating this planning and talking to people and having real life kind of conversations about how this would work before the emergency ever happens.
Do I get one more, Claire? All right, so this will just wrap it up, Tamika. It's a good one. You know, we have a lot of passionate people about mobility and transportation and cycling and everything else in our community. And I assume a lot of them are on this call right now. You have quite the background and number of experiences under your belt as well. It seems that you may have hit a roadblock while on the California Transportation Commission. We don't have to go into those details, but what advice do you have for others, you know, that are doing this same kind of work, valuable work, and feel that they've hit an insurmountable roadblock, or, I mean, there's challenges all along the way. So how do you keep going, Tamika?
Yeah, I always tell people I had the shortest stint ever on our state transportation commission when the governor appointed me last year, and that roadblock was, I think, an important one to talk about because I think it's one a lot of people face. It was that, you know, the firm I worked at, our lawyers determined that it would be a conflict of interest to work at to serve on the board of the body that gives out money for transportation projects, and then on the other end be bidding for transportation projects. Now, it's not quite that simplistic. There's a lot of, you know, cities and MPOs and different people who touch that money first, that it's not actually tied to the decision of the CTC. But as a result, I stepped down, and what that results in is you end up having a ton of people on a commission about transportation that might not actually have that much day-to-day, you know, knowledge or work in transportation, because those are the folks who aren't conflicted out, right? And the reason I share that example is because, to me, that's one of those barriers that I think a lot of us face that is insurmountable. It's process, it's bureaucracy, it's rules, right? And it's those moments where we've all had these times when we're like, well, I want to do something, and then something pops up and you're like, well, that's not fair, right? And so I think when you hit those roadblocks, it's very easy to say, well, I don't have any power, I can't change it, you know, so I'm just going to walk away. And what I always encourage people to do is, one, first, know when you should walk away. Like, we don't have to burn ourselves out every time. I especially tell this to women of color, right? You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. So sometimes you have to realize when that's not your battle. But I think other times you have to realize that even in the pain of feeling like you don't have any power, you still have more power than someone else. Even to get to that position, I had a certain amount of power and privilege. And so how can I use this position that I'm in to speak out about it, to be honest about it, to talk about how unfair it is, and then to find other ways to make an impact? And I think that's the thing. Sometimes when we hit barriers, we like to feel bad about it. And again, if that's what you have to do for your self-care, do it. But how can you continue to push yourself when you know something isn't fair, to fight back and to fight for change, or to encourage other people to step up in the places you can't be and to do that work? And so, you know, after school special style, don't give up.
Nice, thanks.
It's an awesome place to end it, actually, because the last thing I want to do is remind people about the opportunity to use their power to speak up, to get involved with the City of Colorado Springs Connect COS meeting that's happening tomorrow night. That's 5:30. It's virtual, just like this one. They're also asking you to pre-register, so that's coloradosprings.gov/connectcos. I would love to see some of you there, bringing the fantastic concepts and advice that Tamika has given us tonight to that forum to enact change for our city. So thank you so much, Tamika, for your time, for sharing with us. We certainly appreciate it. And I hope you all have a warm and enjoyable rest of your evening. We will be sharing this presentation on our website, downtowncs.com/city center. You can look for it there in about a week. Thank you all.